Hello and welcome to UNIfy. My name's David Wilson. I'm Director of Bradford UNESCO City of Film. I'm joined today by Dr. Yunis, who is Programme Leader for the BA degree course in Sociology here at the University of Bradford. He's also a researcher and author of this book, Race, Taste, Class and Cars. Hi Yunis.
Hello.
We're also going to hear from some people involved in a new theatre production called Peaceophobia and look around some really smart looking cars. Before we delve into our chat about this area, I just wanted to recall some inspirational films, and there are literally hundreds to choose from, that have celebrated and elevated the motor vehicle over the decades. Here are just a few film titles that you might want to revisit on a wet weekend. Who remembers Bullitt in 1968 with Steve McQueen? The Italian Job in 1969, which probably was the best advert ever for the Mini. And the car chase scenes from the film The Blues Brothers, 1980 that was. At the time it was said to be the most expensive car chase scene of ever in a movie. I'm sure that's been surpassed since then. And I'll come back to some contemporary titles a little later on. Yunis, were you inspired by some of these classic car movies from the past decades?
Yeah, I think it was hard not to be. I mean, they were just there, and you know, if you engage with them, if you watch the films, whether they're on telly or cinema or whatever, they were very evocative, and they kind of draw you in. Some of them later became kind of iconic, not just the sequences, but the cars that were in there. So I mean, some of the films that you mentioned, you know, the Blues Brothers, it was kind of a firm favourite of mine, and one of the...
It still is with me.
Yeah, the whole car chase, and at the end of it, you know, the thing just collapses and just dies,
Yeah.
poor thing. But even when the car's introduced in that film, you know, it's given a kind of sort of credibility, because, you know, the brothers Jake and Elwood's the one who's picking his brother Jake up from prison.
That's right.
And he says, "You're picking me up in a cop car, how can you?" And then Elwood, the Dan Aykroyd character, says, "Well, it's a cop car, it's got cop springs, cop suspension, cop engine, blah, blah, blah. And it'll withstand everything." And that's a bit of foreshadowing in terms of what happens, because it has this epic marathon journey.
Yeah.
Gets to Chicago, I think, and in the end it just blows up. You know, it doesn't blow up, but it falls apart. So that spoke to the... there are a few examples where the car becomes a character, almost,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, another example, and this is one that my participants spoke about, was the Batman car in the Tim Burton Batman,
course,
the reboot,
yeah.
sort of in the 1980s. And that Batmobile was called the Keaton-mobile, because it's, you know, it's the Batman with Michael Keaton.
Yeah.
And that was an absolutely amazing looking thing, you know. And, you know, I was a young man at that time. I wasn't a kid. But even I was sort of overawed by the aesthetics, the physical presence of the thing. You know, it looked outrageously sophisticated and demand. You know, it was an amazing thing. And I think those sorts of representations of cars, what they can do and how they speak to and with the identity of the person or the character that's driving, really, really interesting, because they also help develop plot and narrative through the kind of enhancing feature of the characters that they're associated with. So yeah, really, yeah, I think that's, you know, in the back of my mind, it's always sort of been there.
And as an iconic sort of intervention in a movie, in a story, and the speed thing, the whole obsession with chasing and speed and criminality, and we'll uncover some of that, we'll unpick some of that about car culture specifically. Can I ask you though, what led to the research initially behind the book? What led you to do this?
Well, it kind of picks up on the point you've already asked about sort of cinema. You know, I don't really remember a time in my life without cars, and that's not to say I was sort of born driving or anything like that, but, you know, my earliest memories around sort of cars my dad might have had, and one of the memories that is still locked in there, and memory is an interesting thing because it isn't always necessarily real, but I remember being about 5 or 6 and helping push my dad's Vauxhall Cresta, which he had in the 1970s sort of thing. So I remember that. And, you know, just in the world of play, you know, I suppose it's gendered to some extent, but, you know, young lads still probably get toy cars. So, you know, some of my favourite cars were toys, and then there was cinema and television as well, and the representation of these things. And then in the real world as well, you know, as you get older, you know, I was one of those kids who had a poster of a sports car on my bedroom, you know, or even a drawing, and, you know, those were the things that you drew when you were doodling or whatever. So they've always been there, and I think that's broadly sort of representative for a lot of young men. Again, it's not universal, but, you know, depending on your kind of background and where you're at in the world in terms of your class and everything else, you know, that might be a kind of common sort of shared experience. And then, of course, when you go through that rite of passage where you pass your driving test,
Of course, yeah.
other things you notice in terms of, you know, who's driving or who's got the car, and therefore, to some extent, who's got the capacity, and then who are the passengers. So there's a bit of a kind of power thing going on there.
Definitely.
It's very subtle, and it isn't explicitly kind of communicated. But you know how to play that game to some extent. You know what the rules are, in a sense. And I became quite conscious very early on, and even before I was driving probably, about what cars represented and what they signified, in a broader sort of sense. So my interest in cars really preceded my interest in cars from an academic vantage point. You know, and in some ways I was probably doing sociology without knowing it, in terms of how I perceived and understood cars and what I took from them, and even behaviours, you know. And having been born and brought up in Bradford, you saw a diversity of cars, you know, and depending on what sort of areas of work you undertook, you could see a kind of cross-section of cars as well,
yeah.
and owners. And that was the interesting thing, the relationship between the car and the owner, and sometimes what it clearly signified, and sometimes the disruption in that signification, you know. So that was really interesting. And then once I started my academic journey and started doing research from a very early stage in my sort of academic career, the car featured as something quite important in the lives. You know, my research has always been qualitative and really about texture and depth and seeing what people feel and believe and interpret. Cars seem to be a recurrent theme. You know, cars seem to be important to especially some of the samples that I was constructing. You know, young Pakistani heritage men, British born invariably. Cars seem to be important. And again, there was a lot of sociology there. And over the years, I think that's what I've developed, and I've developed a kind of a sociological grounding and insight into looking at cars as not just sort of objects of consumption. They have meaning. They have meaning in the lives of the people who do own them and consume them and do things with them.
I think films and TV shows certainly did have an influence on people from our generation. You know, some of the things we've talked about with regards to cars, but also villains on their own and kind of the law to an extent. And it's still true today. And I'll sort of dig a bit deeper with that a little bit later on. You know, from the classics, like you said, James Bond, the Aston Martin, iconic films, I suppose, even like Thelma and Louise,
sure, yeah,
you know, the road movies. And I also remember being traumatised the first time I saw Spielberg's film Duel,
right,
which has got the truck chasing the guy. And I must have been quite young. I think it was 1972 when that came out. But because you never really see the character driving the tanker.
Yeah,
you know,
there is no.
The tanker is the character, this evil character. But I do remember for a long time being a passenger in my parents' car and just being a bit wary about being on motorways in particular after that film.
Yeah.
You know, you look back at it now and it might seem a little bit, there's no real special effects and stuff, there's some stunts in it.
Yeah.
You know, so there is that whole idea of the car being kind of, you know, this kind of enemy. And then the driving excellence portrayed in films like Baby Driver, and the Fast and Furious franchise, of course, you know, which many of the sort of younger generation would be more familiar with. And I think the attraction of that film, I'm told by many people, is not actually the content of the acting capability or even the storyline. It's the cars.
It's
the cars are the thing that people want to see, and partly how they're driven. But it was really interesting yesterday speaking to some of the people that are contributing towards this whole discussion with their cars, and talking about YouTube and social media, and the fact that where an earlier generation may have been inspired by the movies and think about the cars and the car chase. What is happening more and more is that young people are more inspired by clips they've seen on YouTube and actually making their own YouTube clips and sharing those around. Did the social media kind of feature in your research?
It did to some extent in various ways. You know, it wasn't purely about the cars. And the interesting thing that you raised there, and the valuable thing, I think, is the extent to which today, and probably over the last 10 years, you know, we are a new version of a media consumer. We're not as passive as we might have been. That's one way of looking at it. Yeah. So people who consume social media in particular are likely, much more likely than previously, to actually be producers of content as well. So, you know, you use the word influence. We might have been influenced by these films, whether it was, you know, Fast and Furious or Driver or whatever, you know. we're more likely to be influenced by ourselves or versions of ourselves or others like us, ordinary people who are doing spectacular things with their cars, not necessarily driving, but the way they're modding them up or customizing them. And that was certainly a kind of, not quite, it wasn't something that I particularly followed up in the research. I was more interested in other things. And that actually also speaks to generational differences, right? I'm an older fogey. These are younger. I don't do social media. I haven't got a Twitter thing. I've got a YouTube channel, but that's about it.
Yeah.
And even then, I don't feature on my YouTube channel. I kind of upload other videos and stuff. So I'm not comfortable in putting myself out there in the way that younger people might be or other people might be. So I think that participatory culture now that we have, where in a sense, if you're going to be cynical about it, everything can be shared with everyone, right?
Yeah.
And I think that makes the transmission of ideas and innovations much more easy.
Yeah.
And we don't have to rely on, if you like, these traditional forms of mass media.
Exactly, and I always think it democratises filmmaking and storytelling, and the ability to be able to shoot something on your phone and post it up that day. An idea, a response to someone else's idea.
That's an important word you use there, stories. Because I think even within the practice of Instagram or Snapchat, I don't know which one it is, but there are these things called stories. You can have your stories. I think that's what they call them.
Yes, they are.
Again, apologies if I'm not au fait with the language. But it's about narrativizing your own life, right? You end up, it might be significant to you, and it arguably might be significant to other people as well. So I think that turn, if you like, in terms of media development and social media is very important, especially when you talk about, which is what I talk about in the book about taste.
Yes.
And taste becomes, to some extent, shared. In terms of what is aesthetically pleasing or what is not exactly a norm, but, what are innovations and what are deemed to be widely held views around good enhancements, for example. And that's purely in the world of enhancements. And, I talk about more than enhancements.
Well, we come on to that. In my next question, what I'd want to talk about is class, ethnicity and taste in relation to Bradford and cars. And at some point within your answer or our discussion, is Bradford very different from other areas of the UK that you're aware of? Is it a phenomenon in Bradford, the car culture?
Well, yes and no, and that's a bit of a cop-out answer. I think yes, it's got a very specific car culture and it's got a reputation around cars. Some of that, that reputation isn't wholly coherent.
Okay.
In the minds of the people who are actually very invested in Bradford, either sort of politically or from a civic point of view, and consider themselves to be deeply Bradfordian in their identity, right? There will be views and counter-views, in that Bradford is, one of the participants. I said, Bradford's a car city.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the cars, it's what people do with cars, and it's the infrastructure that's there in the city itself. I kind of say, like, some parts of the city, in some neighbourhoods, you can throw a brick or a stone, and you'll hit some building that is devoted to the car in one way or another, whether it's a body shop, an accessory shop, or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? And
there's electricians.
Everything, detailing, valeting and all that. But I don't think it's entirely unique and particular, because you find this sort of activity wherever there are relatively, not even ethnically diverse, but diverse in terms of age range of a demography of a city, where you get younger people, where there is disposable income. You will find that there are economic infrastructure and service infrastructure that will feed the demands of that population. And it's a bit like what happened after the Second World War in the 1950s, with the emergence of subcultures in Britain. There was reasonably good levels, high levels of employment, disposable income. People were walking around like teddy boys. They were spending money on their own identity, and I think this is a version of that.
Okay.
And therefore, it's not just Bradford, but Bradford does have a relatively wide, and I would say sort of almost a global and international reputation. It didn't feature in the book, but at an earlier conference, I gave a paper quite a few years ago, and I used forum messages, and they were global and international, and there were people from all over the world, and they were talking about these cars that were spotted, and that's a phrase, spotted in Bradford, and whether they were Lamborghinis, Ferraris, or customized cars, or whatever, and people were talking about them, whether they were based in Canada or whether they were based in Pakistan, India, Middle East, wherever. And the language that people were using was interesting as well. It was a very sort of almost sexualized language, because they were talking about these cars as hotties. And sort of like very attractive things.
Yeah.
So I think Bradford, on the one hand, has that very potent sort of reputation, and some of it is quite negative, especially when you start talking about driving behaviours.
Yeah, and we'll come on to that. We'll come on to some of the negative aspects. But is that related to ethnicity? the phenomenon of Bradford having this kind of reputation, almost like you say, global reputation for car culture. Is there a direct link between that and ethnicity?
It's interesting. I'm not wholly convinced it is. I think there is something there. On the one hand, I'm drawn toward the work of people like Paul Gilroy, sort of a sociologist, and he's done a lot of work in America, and especially in terms of race relations. And he talked about African Americans disproportionately investing in their cars. And that is a sort of rehearsal of identity that reaches beyond their structural position, if you like. So it's a way of magnifying your identity to some extent. I think some of that happens in Bradford. You know, especially if you're faced with the lived experience of lacking opportunities, and ways to move on and to enhance your maybe economic and cultural capital. Then you devote some attention to exemplifying your character and possibly magnifying your character and identity and persona through this sort of ritual use of a car, you know, through either buying a car that's very expensive and maintaining it, or buying a car that's not so expensive and customizing it or enhancing it or making it look spectacular in some way. So I think that is to some extent around ethnicity, but also importantly around class.
Yes.
So, you know, when I talk to people, when I was interviewing people, particularly people who, you know, those who were from a middle class heritage and background, or had achieved middle class status, if you like, you know, they were professionals and they were comfortable and they wouldn't buy the kind of car that the younger people who were perhaps at a working class position, they would buy cars that are already quite equipped and quite good at emitting status. And in fact, not the weird thing, but the interesting thing was that these people demonstrated various levels of disgust toward this working class practice. And that's also really interesting theoretically, you know, because Pierre Bourdieu talks about disgust and how middle class taste differs to working class taste and practice and so on.
It's just fascinating that we can get this in depth already when we're only scratching the surface, aren't we?
Well, I mean,
when it comes to cars and culture in Bradford.
Well, I mean, that sort of speaks to my own sort of sadness, I suppose. I mean, I find it very interesting.
Not at all, it's fascinating.
Well, I mean, you know, the book that I've written, it could have been twice as long. I could have written another book about it. I had to kind of forego lots of stuff that was interesting to me. But, you know, there is so much. You can write about this stuff forever. There are so many aspects that you can cover.
Well, now we're going to hear from Ali, who organises regular car meets in Bradford as the Bradford Modified Car Club, and is also part of the theatre production Peaceophobia.
Modifying cars falls into a lot of different categories. So, for example, I've had cars prior to my current car where I've modified them in such a way where people have kind of like copied the style, and I don't mind that because people, especially people younger than me, I kind of like that because I feel as though I'm being a bit of an inspiration to that young person, if you like, or I feel like I'm being a bit of a role model because, you know, they're following my kind of footsteps, and I don't mind it, but I like to know that my car is different from everybody else's, whether it's a badge in a different colour, whether it's, you know, a bit of paint on the car that's a bit different. But cars are definitely unique, in car culture especially, you know, cars are definitely unique to the individual person. So my car is an Edition 35. There's only a limited amount of them made, and there's only a limited amount of them left in the UK. That's why I kind of purchased it. I could have just bought a normal Mark 6 Volkswagen Golf Mark 6 GTI, but it doesn't kind of stand out for me. There's a number of different areas you can modify cars. There's, you know, your exterior, that's your outside visual. There's your engine, that's more internal, you know, gearbox, short shifter, induction kit, bigger turbo. And each one of those components kind of branch off into 100 other things. So if I put an induction kit, you know, that means my car needs to then get remapped. If it needs to get remapped, then the fuel needs to be right. Then you need a high pressure fuel pump, which leads on to 100 other things. But like, there's the exterior, you know, like mine, I've gone for a bit of both. I've got my wheels done by a well-known chap in Bradford, Tricolour Coatings, Paddy. He's done my car, my wheels, as a one-off. It's a shadow chrome, but it's a very light shadow chrome. I was literally stood there whilst he was painting, and I was like, stop, that's my colour, that is me, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? And he was finding it so fascinating that how picky car people can be and how kind of, we can be so nitty about little things. I hope Peaceophobia does raise awareness of car culture in Bradford, but also the stigma and the stereotype around, brown boy, black car, alarm bells, call the police, there's something going on. Do you know what I mean? I hope it just defeats that and it raises that awareness. I hope police officers do attend and, kind of see it from our view. Personally, I come from an acting background, so I studied acting drama for GCSE and carried it through A-level. I've been in a number of little bits and bats, short films, etc, etc. But I think, personally, I wanted to explore my creativity again with expressing my feelings. I think I don't think I'd be acting in the play. I think I'd just be my natural self, because it is me. It's about me. It's about people like me. It's about my friends. It's about my car club. It's about my community and my family. I was actually away in Germany. I was a full-time youth worker at that time, working with young people and stuff. So I was in Germany doing this tour, meeting other young people and helping them out, etc, etc. I met this one young person from Bradford, and she said to me, "Ali, you're into cars and stuff. I need a hand with something." And I'm like, "What is it?" And at the time, I wasn't really interested, because I was just so busy with work and juggling home and family and my own cars and doing bits and bats. And then when she told me about what they're kind of trying to tackle in terms of Peaceophobia and how it's trying to tackle, it's basically tackling Islamophobia, but they're trying to do it through attracting people through cars and defeating stereotypes. And I'm like, you know what, I need this, because at the time I started running a car club called Bradford Modified Club. It's basically a car club where people come from different backgrounds, different colours, different religions, all come to one place to meet, to have a good time. And the kind of subject is cars, really. I got asked to take part in this campaign, get a car meet going in the middle of City Park, and I'm like, this is brilliant, because it is government land, first of all. Second of all, I just want to prove them wrong and show that actually we're all full of colour. Do you know what I mean? We're not trying to be dull. We're not trying to, jump on, take anyone's limelight or anything. We're just here to have a good time and get all these people from different communities coming together. I have people coming from, as far as Manchester, Brighouse, Leeds. I've had people come from Scarborough, Blackpool, just to come to Bradford, to visit Bradford, to look at the cars and look at the culture and stuff, yeah.
Thanks to Ali there for his contribution, and also to the other contributors for exhibiting their wonderful cars. Yunis, can we touch on production and modification briefly? Sure. Is it all about the mods, and why is that such an important factor? And a kind of supplementary question, is the idea of the modifications to get your car to be like somebody else's, to look like someone else's, or is it around uniqueness, or is it the two? I was a bit confused by my discussion.
Slightly strange one, and it's something I've given quite a bit of thought to. I think on the one hand, that the kind of individual's aspiration is to have a sense of uniqueness, and that uniqueness is informed by their own identity, which is in turn informed by their taste. To inscribe that onto this chunk of metal, right? So that's kind of what's going on in people's heads, that they want it to somehow reflect who they are as a person. Now, that's a very strange thing to say, because how can you inscribe who you think you are on a car? But what you can inscribe is your creativity, right? So that's going on. But that doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? So there is a broader there are a series of broader aesthetics. So, for example, you might remember, and I certainly remember when I was growing up, people were customizing their cars, in the sort of 80s and 70s and even early, there's a big heritage of customizing cars. But in those days, the aesthetic was actually to jack a car up from the back.
Yeah.
Right? Especially from the back, it'd have bigger wheels on, and it'd have raised leaf springs or suspension. Now the aesthetic has changed, and that's evolved, and it's to have it lower, it's low and slow sort of thing. So the aesthetics have changed, but there is a broader buy-in to those aesthetic turns. But that doesn't mean to say that everybody's conforming to the same thing. To some extent that happens, but by default, every car that you encounter is unique. You can have two cars owned by two different people that are exactly the same when they roll off the production line, and those two characters will do very different things. Some of them might look similar, some of them very different. You know, in the clip you saw two cars that were pretty much identical. One was white and one was red. These were Golf Edition 35s. They were exactly the same car when they came off the production line, but actually each person has done something entirely different to their cars.
Yeah.
And there may be a bit of crossover. There may be a bit of, oh, I like that, and that's what I'm going to do to mine as well. But that's healthy, and that's, you know, in the language of kind of integration and cohesion and all that, that seems to be like a good thing that's happening in a sort of communitarian sense.
Yeah.
So, you know, these are communities of practice, and therefore they share some common values and ideals and so on and so forth. But that doesn't detract from the fact that they're actually doing a lot of identity work, to my mind. It sits within, you know, anything that we do. You know, if you might be interested in fine art, you might be interested in film, cinema, right? And that's part of what your identity is. And I think the cars are an exemplar of that as well.
And I think that the point you raised earlier on as well about the supply chain and the fact that in Bradford you can get all of these expertise as well as the modifications, the actual parts to go on the car. You can get the expertise that can tell you how to fit it, and that's why they look as good as they do. Is it all about modification? I mean, generally the people that could come to the car meets that we've just seen, some of the cars that they're, will they all be modified?
No. I mean, those events, those car meets are really a showcase for cars of all sorts. So some won't be modified, but they'll be very old, you know, vintage or classic or cars that were contemporaneous in the 1980s, for example, right?
I wish I'd have kept my sister's Ford Capri in a garage somewhere.
Exactly, you know, but those cars are really very, very, very expensive, very sought after and highly collectible.
Yeah.
And, you know, they carry a lot of weight in terms of the owner's esteem and prestige, right? So there's that. And then you get all the cars that are modded up to hell. I mean, I remember I turned up to one of these car meets and there was a guy who'd had can't remember what it was, it might have been a Ford or a Honda, and he'd made a front splitter, and he made it out of wood, and he covered it in carbon fibre sort of wrap, you know, and it was like, well, that's
Did it look good?
Not particularly to my mind, but that's a kind of another, it's a bit like punk, you know, DIY culture sort of thing, right? Yeah. So there's that, and then, you know, at these car meets, you'll see really, really expensive super and hypercars there turning up. Yeah. So it's the variety, it's the gamut of cars, you know, you can have sort of 1970s and 80s cars in these things. You know, I've seen some really nice cars that take me back to my childhood, you know, and there's lots of conversation with the people who have them, who own these cars and what they've done to them and why they have them and all that sort of stuff. And then you'll see guys kind of cruise in a Lambo or something, right? Yeah. Or a Bentley, you know, I turned up to one, there's a guy in a Bentley rocks in, you know. And it's fine, it's
but there's
all
an appreciation
good.
for the craftsmanship of the car and the artistry of the engine, the noise and everything else goes with it.
Look, you know, I turned up to one of these in an old banger that I had, and people were asking questions. I mean, it was just an old, at the time it was an old banger, and it was sort of emblematic of me kind of going even more native. You know, I was becoming part of that sort of subculture, and it's very difficult to kind of get out of in a way. And not that I wanted to, but you become absorbed with the culture, and to the point that I ended up buying a car that was, it was sort of valued and prized. I mean, it wasn't particularly expensive or anything. It was just an experiment in a way to myself. And to me, it was just that. But, you know, I'd turn up to these meets and people saying, you know, my dad used to have one of them when I was a kid, or my uncle had one, or my big brother, you know. And it was like a 1989 car, an old Toyota. Yeah. But I became really invested in the practice and the culture of getting this car up to spec, making it look reasonably presentable, you know.
Fantastic. And did you feel better turning up to the meets when you'd got that, you know, that?
A bit better, yeah, I did. When it was when it wasn't stalling on me, and when it, you know, had a nice bit of paint on it and stuff.
Well, can we dig a little bit into the social psychological insights from your research, you know, and particularly, I suppose, it's the multi-ethnic spaces that you refer to. Right. I suppose if you could say a little bit more about that.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the car is a signifier, right? That's first and foremost. And, you know, there's a long history of literature and research and, you know, even public discourse about cars and status and what they signify. You know, whether certain cars in certain colours or certain sizes, they represent something. You know, there are these well-established tropes, you know, and that signify masculinity or femininity and so on. And the other, in the Bradford context, and I suppose in other multi-ethnic contexts, there are also cars that are racial or ethnic signifiers as well. You know, historically, you might remember in the 1980s there was this shorthand for BMW. Yeah. right? And, you know, this was the racialized trope and the stereotype. BMW stood for either black man's wheels or Bob Marley wagon.
Yeah.
And there was a kind of association and connotation between BMW cars and people who have African Caribbean heritage, right?
Yeah.
Rightly or wrongly, I mean, it was there and it was grounded into everyday normative discourse. And in a similar way, then, in the Bradford context, there are certain cars that were, up to relatively recently, associated with particular ethnic groups. So
The Nissans and the Toyotas,
Yeah, Japanese-
taxi drivers, really.
yeah, well,
Would-
yeah, but
yeah.
even sort of in the 70s and 80s, I mean, I've written a little bit about the background of that in the book, but, you know, there was a rationale, an economic rationale for people who are Pakistani especially heritage, to go for those sorts of cars, partly because they were economical, also because they were relatively cheap and reliable.
Yeah.
And that's what you needed.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you're a first generation economic migrant, and you were settling in a part of the city and you're working and your family was with you, you know, it was really a job to keep the wolf from the door in many cases. And I say this speaking from one of those families. You know, my dad worked, and I mean, the interesting thing is my dad didn't have a car for many years, but I know other families who did. And it wasn't about your identity, really. I mean, in effect it was, but it wasn't a conscious decision. You were really interested in making sure that you had a car that you could afford to run and that worked.
Yeah.
That was it. And it needed to have a certain set of functions, and that needed to be about the family. 4 doors or estates, hatchbacks when they started to come along. It really wasn't until the second generation were British born and bred that people started moving away from that merely kind of utilitarian use of the car, and they started to look at cars that spoke to their identity. So, you know, people of my dad's generation, they weren't universally buying Japanese cars. You know, my dad didn't, and lots of other people didn't as well, but there was a bit of a brand preference for Japanese cars, and various reasons for that. But it was their kids who started developing out. And over the last 20 years, there's been a complete almost abandonment of Japanese cars in some contexts amongst Pakistanis. And that's not unusual, because even in Britain, the big sellers, you know, the most popular selling car in Britain has been, I think, the Golf, possibly the Focus. Yeah. So there's been a strong turn towards German manufactured cars because they have a reputation and because they've prestige and so on and so forth as well. So there was an ethnic taste, and I kind of refer to a guy called Daniel Miller, who's an anthropologist, and, you know, people appropriate him from different disciplines, and I've done that. And he talks about ethnic taste in Trinidad. And it's really interesting read, right? And he talks about soft drinks in Trinidad. And he talks about the population in Trinidad. And Trinidad has kind of like an Indo-Trinidadian population of people who are indentured labourers who came over from India during the height of the Raj and the Empire, toward the end of it, really. And they were there as part of the civil service in Trinidad. And then you had the kind of Afro-Trinidadians, right? So you've got these two sort of quite disparate and distinctive populations. And he says in Trinidad, there's this interesting idea around taste. Yeah. Because in Trinidad, there are two types of cola drink, right? So I'm talking about cola drinks. Okay. So bear with me. There's a red drink and there's a black drink, right? The red drink is sweeter. I think I'm getting it the right way around. The red drink is the sweeter drink and the dark drink isn't. And there is a perception that the red drink is favoured by the Indo-Trinidadians. Right. And that becomes ethnic taste because it's sweeter, and therefore, because we know, you know, as far as that goes, that Indians have a sweet tooth. And we know they have a sweet tooth. Why? Well, because they have higher incidences of diabetes. So there becomes this circular logic that informs perceptions of taste. Right. Indians prefer the sweeter drink because they prefer sweeter things. They've got a sweet tooth, and we know they've got a sweet tooth because they're more likely to get diabetes, right? But out of all that comes this kind of differential of taste. Red drink, sweeter drink for the Indo-Trinidadians, and the other drink for Afro-Trinidadians. And something similar happens in Bradford in relation to cars. We know that, you know, Pakistani heritage people in Bradford, they're still on a kind of migrant narrative to some extent, not universally so. Certainly up to the 1980s, I would say, and therefore they go for the car that suits their economic needs. Yeah. What happened subsequently with subsequent generations is a kind of doing away with that model, with that hypothesis, to the point that when I was talking to young people about their cars and their preferences, you know, I was talking to a young woman, Pakistani heritage, and I said, you know, what sort of car do you fancy? And she said, well, you know, maybe an Audi A3 or a nice Golf or I really would like to get a Q7. You know, this is a big Audi, right? Big SUV thing.
Yeah.
I said, really? Well, you know, you're only young. I mean, what's wrong with a nice little Micra or a Toyota? And I'm not kidding. There was absolute disgust on her face. She said, I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't dream of it. I would rather take the bus, she said, rather than be seen. So you see, the thing is that there's a perception and an understanding and an appreciation or a lack of appreciation towards certain brands, not because of the brands themselves, but what they signify.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that.
Yeah. So anyway, you'll have to read more about it.
Yeah, definitely. You need to buy the book, read more about that particular chapter. We're going to hear now from Mariyah at Speaker's Corner, who is the producer of Peaceophobia. And so let's see what Mariyah has to say about this amazing theatre production.
Peaceophobia was a campaign in 2018 that was created from Speaker's Corner. Speaker's Corner is a social, creative, political space based in Bradford. And a lot of work Speaker's Corner is for young women, and we realised we have this platform for young women, but there's not so much for young men, especially young Muslim men. So we wanted to kind of do something for them, and we realised in Bradford that this massive car culture, and you know, a lot of people think that they've got these cars through illegal activities, but for these people, for the Bradford Modified Club, for the people we're working with, it's an art, it's a hobby. And we just wanted to show the people that so much time and effort goes into it. It's pride for them. So we did like a massive car meet in City Park. There was 25 cars, there was poetry, spoken word, there was a paint fight, and it was just really showing really the beauty of the cars. And then we realised there was something really special and important. So we decided to turn it into a play, and Commonwealth are turning it into a show, which will happen in September. I think it's important to tell the story in this way because we are dealing with like Islamophobia, with Islam, cars, car culture, and they can seem like quite heavy subjects. So the way we're showing it is through the stories of three men, and it's their stories, and it's done in like a way that there's comedy. You see the friendship and brotherhood within the boys, you see like this other side, and then rather than saying this is Islamophobia, this is all the negative stuff, it's saying this is our lives and this is also part of it, and you can't separate the two, and we're going to show you, but it's going to be done in a way that's still light. And while there's some like intense topics and some things that are quite dark, it's still shown in a light way. And I think that way people engage more and they learn more rather than just having something thrown at them. The audience we hope to reach are, of course, like car lovers, people who, you know, who don't usually go to the theatre, who won't really think that the theatre is for them. And we want to reach them. We want to reach people who just want to know more about Islam and Islamophobia, who have an interest in cars, people who maybe are politically interested and that side appeals to them. Even I think as well we want to reach people who who might be thinking the negative side of these cars, or might be thinking, oh, these boys have these fast cars and how are they getting them, and just kind of show a different perspective. I think really it's for everyone, and in a way we hope to reach everyone, and it's just whoever it appeals to. I think Bradford is quite unique in its terms of like car culture. The idea itself for Peaceophobia came from someone who doesn't live in Bradford, and she was like, there's a massive car culture here that we need to kind of highlight and raise. And the way we did it, I think, is quite special as well through theatre. And the Bradford Modified Club, who we're working with, they don't have big flashy cars. It's just cars that they have and they've been modified. So like they'll put in a different engine, they'll put in different wheels, and they'll build a sound system in the back. But even in terms of like when there's a wedding or an event, in anything happening in Bradford, people will pull out their cars, they'll hire cars. It's something that is part of the culture here. So people can see the show really by just buying a ticket, and they'll go for sale just before it happens, so early September. But definitely if everyone keeps an eye out on like our social medias, we'll always keep updating on there, and there'll be links to where and how you can buy our tickets.
Thank you, Mariyah. And there'll be more information on how to book for Peaceophobia at the end of this session and on social media feeds. Yunis, we can't finish this session without some reference to the perceptions of criminal activity associated with cars, even generally, and that whole danger aspect of speed, racing. What can you tell us about that? And is the perception kind of in perspective?
Well, it's understandable. I understand the logics of the perception and the narratives that surround cars' behaviour among certain groups and individuals and types. I think a lot of that is informed by stereotype, however, you know, and the development of stereotypes are very interesting just to look at and to see how they work and where they come from. So, on the one hand, in Bradford, there are certain myths and stereotypes about certain types of car and driver. So, and a lot of people are very wary and conscious of this, and despite the fact they still drive those cars. So, one example is I was talking to a guy who's got his own business. It's a family-run business, very successful business. Massive turnover, and he spoke to me about the fact that theirs was a conscious decision to make sure that all the partners in the business had very expensive, nice, new cars with private number plates and all that, and it was a kind of marketing decision, and it was a decision that was like the logics of it made sense to me, and it's when we get clients or we get customers turning up, they'll see outside our offices a fleet of these cars, and they're all very expensive looking. That sets the company up as one that is doing well. It instills in the mind of the beholder an impression, and that impression is, well, these guys must be doing really well, right? So, company that is reliable, trustworthy, and all the rest of it. And this same guy is then telling me, I know that my car represents and signifies something. And, in fact, he's had first-hand experience, his friends, his relatives, his family or whatever telling him, why are you driving that car? It's a particular type of car, and everybody knows what that car means. And it's a typical thug, gangster, drug dealer car. And his point was, I don't care, because I know I'm not a drug dealer, right? Yeah. So he's prepared to take the risk to drive that car, and the risk can be kind of imperceptible, where onlookers might see the car and think, oh, drug dealer, or he might get stopped by the police, right? So despite those risks, people are still prepared to do that identity work or do that representational work. So that's on the one hand. I do understand, where the fears are around speed, danger, and very risky driving. And let's be honest, the car is a killing machine. In the wrong hands, that's what it can do. Even at 35, 40 miles an hour, you can actually end somebody's life, right? Yeah. Completely understand the concerns around that. But I think the concerns, to some extent, are amplified and exaggerated, born out of statistics. The problem that derives from that comes from that, is the extent to which there appears to be disproportionality. And this is something that people in my sample refer to over and over again. Perfectly legitimate drivers driving cars that are legal, they've got MOT, they've got insurance, they've got road tax. There's nothing wrong with the cars. In fact, these guys look after their cars better than they look after themselves, right? They fawn over these cars, and to me, this is ridiculous. They clean their boots out with toothbrushes, for God's sake. I mean, who does that? Yeah. So they're very invested in these cars. I think I know partly why, but leave that to one side, and yet they feel that they're the ones who are regularly targeted. That's the only way that I can put it.
By the police?
Well, by the police, but actually also...
Or other members of the public.
As they form a part of the social imagination in which a certain type of driver in a certain type of car constitutes a certain type of risk or threat or problem, right? So, there are other examples. I remember just talking to a guy, and this wasn't actually even in this research. This goes back to early research, and I just so happened to be talking about it. And he had a really nice car. And he was saying, the number of times I've been stopped on this road by the police because they think I'm a kind of criminal or a drug dealer. And he said, only once did an officer ask me what is it I did, and I told him, and I said, officer, I work for the Inland Revenue. Right? That kind of disruption then, that causes a disruption. And again, I've fallen victim to that. I've fallen victim and subject to these stereotypes. There's an example I talk about in the book. I'm filling fuel into my car, and a car pulls up, and it's an exotic looking Japanese sports car, and I know what this car is, and I know everything about it. And I imagine then, I write this up in my field notes, who this guy is, and he's like some young thug life guy. He's some dude who likes his car, and he might be a bit wide, and he might be a bit... So I start talking to this guy. I kind of do my spiel about research, working at the uni. I'm interested in cars. What is it you do? Well, this is an old example, by the way, but it's still a very important one. He's a consultant. He works at LGI. I subsequently followed up with interviews with this guy. Very interesting guy, very interesting car narrative, and he actually had a lot to say about working in the NHS as well. So we're all subject to these. Apparently enlightened sociologist, ethnographer who knows all about this stuff and how all these stereotype things work. So I understand where they come from. I understand where these narratives and ideas and how they circulate, and the extent to which even the people who are subject to them buy into them. Yeah. I've talked to people about criminality and drug dealing and all this stuff and the association with car culture, and they're actually talking about themselves. I talked to a middle-class woman, lives in an affluent part of the city, does a very job very well, very successfully, and she's kind of saying, well, we know where all the money comes from for all these expensive cars. And I said, what, the bank? I'm being facetious in the interview because I kind of don't like where it's going, And she reacts badly because I'm being facetious, and she says, well, no, what are you talking about? We know it's all drugs. And I said, oh, okay, so you're a drug dealer as well, are you? Because she's got a 30 grand car outside in her drive. Yeah. So, and she takes umbrage to some extent, and it's fine. But the point is, look, you're buying into the myths that define you, all because you see yourself as different and legitimate. Doesn't mean to say you're immune from what the external view says or the external gaze says. Yeah. And I think those external gazes are really potent at the moment. In Bradford, there is a huge amount of kind of public discourse and rhetoric. Quite a bit of it I've noticed through the local newspaper, by the way. It is essentially pathologizing young, predominantly South Asian men who happen to drive nice cars, pathologizing them as either dangerous drivers, either as people who are antisocial, or they're criminal, they're irresponsible, and all those sort of tropes that we generally deem to be negative. I think there's a lot of work to be going on there, and fortunately at the moment I had a conversation a couple of days ago with a little while ago with a senior police officer.
I was going to ask about police and where they sit in all of this.
Yeah, and it was a very interesting conversation because they're aware of all this, and in Bradford there's been a long-running strategy called Operation Stayside, which it aims to make roads safer and less kind of problematic, which is great and fine. But I think there was an appreciation in the conversation of actually there is another way of looking at this. And I think one of the things that authorities more widely ought to be doing to some extent is moving away from this model which perceives all people who drive nice cars as potentially problematic. So it's partly to do with policing, it's partly to do with a broader perception of cars and certain types of users, and perhaps enter into a much more sort of collaborative bit of working which may have different payoffs. On the one hand, it might make roads safer and driving much more, responsible and so on through education and all the rest of it. But actually, it might elicit a bit more trust and engagement with police and the communities that they're trying to serve, rather than being divided and divisive. Because a lot of the young people, even the people who are not doing anything illegal, even the people who are perfectly entitled to drive whatever they want, however they want, but even them, respectable sort of, in quotes, respectable middle-class younger people, even they feel alienated and subject to marginalisation, usually at the hands of the police. And let's not forget, the police aren't necessarily responsible for this. The police are people who transmit enforcement. Yeah. They're not responsible necessarily for political strategy or political ideology which underpins that. Yeah. So I think, that's interesting. I hope to kind of carry on that conversation with the police locally. Yeah. Might take us to interesting places. But yeah, I think it, again, just more generally, that's the subject in itself. It's a book in itself.
Well, coming back to Peaceophobia as well, the fact that there is this theatre production that involves some of the young people involved in the car meets. Sure. Hopefully that will help to break some of it down, some of the perceptions.
Well, I think, for me, the work that's gone on has been personally quite political for me, because to me this is an example of working class car culture, right? Not the whole book, but certainly the subcultural stuff. There is working class culture going on that is transmitted through the relationships that people have with cars, right? And for a long time, there's been an absolute kind of ignorance of that. And it reminds me of stuff that was going on in the 1950s within the kind of cultural studies and sociology of culture stuff. And up to that point, there was only one type of culture. There was no such thing as working class culture. I mean, it existed, but it wasn't recognised. Certainly wasn't valued. And I think we need to perhaps look at ways in which we can see this as a valuable cultural exercise and practice. Yeah. So Peaceophobia is certainly one example of that. Yeah. And I think there's lots of other ways in which we can value this and Definitely. See it as something that isn't vacuous, isn't empty, isn't meaningless, isn't problematic. Because it doesn't have to be that.
Brilliant. And finally, in terms of sustainability, many Formula One teams are now working on performance electric cars. Do you see this filtering down into car culture in the near future, or are we still some way off? And is there a desire for more sustainable product from people involved?
I think it's going to happen eventually. As to when, who knows? I think one of the things at the moment is that with the kind of sort of onslaught of a drive for sustainable and cars that are free of that kind of traditional combustion engine and high polluting engine, it's sort of conversely driving an interest and demand in these old traditional cars, which are going to be, very valuable, maybe 10, 15 years down the line. So I do know that the government, are pushing, and lots of countries are, ULEV vehicles, ultra low emissions vehicles, and they've got targets and all the rest of it. One of the problems with it is, in order to be able to afford one of these cars, you've got to be relatively, I wouldn't say, very highly affluent, but you've got to have the disposable, or you've got to have the income to be able to warrant that. And as we know, newer cars usually, especially new cars that are cutting edge technology, are going to be relatively expensive compared to a second-hand car, which is perfectly usable. Yeah. So I think that's one issue around take-up. And I think the other problem with the electric cars, particularly at the moment, not so much the hybrid one, is around range anxiety, and that is, you only get so many miles to a full charge, and then it takes however long to charge it, and if you want to charge it quickly, you have to buy a special piece of kit, blah, blah, blah. So those are some of the things that are putting off consumers. With people who are involved in car scenes, subcultural car scenes, they're going to innovate. They're going to take whatever's there and work with it and do whatever they see as valuable or insightful or speaking to their identity. I think that's not so much a side issue, but I think that's kind of inevitable. At the moment, however, I don't think we're at that moment where there's a tipping point whereby you can say, right, everybody's going to pivot over to electric cars or ULEV type vehicles. There is still a lot of work to be done, even in mainstream sort of society, in order to make those more sustainable, or those cars that are deemed to be more sustainable, mainstream, simply because we really haven't got the infrastructure. We haven't got enough charging points. There are, again, questions around range anxiety and so on, and then there's the cost as well. So until those cars start to become much more embedded, and there are signs of that, that every year more and more people are buying ULEV cars. Yeah. But they're not, I wouldn't say, trickling down necessarily to the kind of ground street level. Certainly amongst, if you're working class and you're a single parent and you've got 2 jobs, a Nissan Leaf isn't going to be the top of your list. It's going to be a Vauxhall Astra or whatever, right? So there are those things, and again, that's about economic class,
of course,
and how much reach you have. So a lot of this sustainability discourse is actually driven by a politics of class as much as anything else. Yeah. It comes from a relatively privileged, some would say sort of paternal or patronizing kind of vantage point where we're asked, all of us, to buy into this narrative when we haven't got the capacity to do so. Yeah. So I think, it's a relatively long game. In terms of the buy-in from subcultural sort of points of view, there was an interesting example of an American car that was produced, a Ford, I think it might have been a Ford, and it was an electric car and it made no sound, and consumers didn't like the fact that it was silent. So the manufacturer gave it a soundtrack, an exhaust note and an engine note that gave you, the driver, and pedestrians or other road users the illusion that it's actually a real engine. Yeah.
Innovation again.
Innovation again, yeah. So, it's a movable feast. It's still a very open game as far as all that goes, I would say. But, we'll see.
Thanks ever so much, Yunis. That was a fascinating discussion, and what an interesting area. And so we'll draw it to a close there, but we very much hope to see you all in Bradford again very soon. Thank you.